You know that feeling? The news just hits you like a fire hose every day.
Oh, definitely.
You're scrolling, and it's just so much politics, courts, media blunders, even glimpses of future tech. It feels, well, overwhelming.
Absolutely. Trying to really stay informed. It feels like trying to drink from I don't know, a data tsunami.
Totally. And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive. Just for you. You've given us this great stack of sources, a collection of recent news items, really varied stuff.
Hmm.
And our mission really is to take that fire hose and just, turn it into a clear, focused stream.
We're going to unpack your material, pull out the most important bits, the surprising connections maybe. The goal is basically to give you that shortcut so you feel genuinely clued in on what's happening, cutting through the noise.
Yeah, and we've got quite the mix today, all from your sources. There's a pretty dramatic late-night budget vote in the House,
Right.
some clever procedural stuff in the Senate, a surprising Supreme Court deadlock,
Yeah, that was interesting.
a really wild administrative action against Harvard, a bizarre AI media mistake, and actually some genuinely positive news on transportation.
It might seem like a lot of, disconnected threads at first,
Yeah.
but as we dig into your sources, I think you'll see patterns start to emerge.
Okay.
So let's dive into your deep dive.
All right, let's start with that congressional drama then. Your sources really paint a picture of a nail-biter vote in the House on this budget bill. Happened super late, right?
That's right, down to the wire. It finished up really early in the morning, and the final vote count was incredibly tight. 215 for, 214 against, and 1 voting present.
And there were some curveballs in those votes, weren't there? Like 2 Republicans voting no because they thought the cuts didn't go far enough.
Exactly. Representatives Massey and Davidson, they voted nay from, the right flank for that reason. And Representative Harris went even further, voting present out of that same kind of frustration.
Plus, your sources mentioned a couple of Republicans just didn't vote. Schweikert stepped out, and poor Garbarino apparently fell asleep.
It must have been a marathon session. So yeah, on the surface, 215, 214 looks like absolutely zero room to breathe,
Yeah.
especially thinking ahead to when the bill goes to the Senate and then has to come back for another House vote.
But your sources seem to suggest the speaker might actually have a little more wiggle room than it looks.
They do. The analysis in your material, it calculates that after the Senate makes its changes, which are expected, the speaker probably has closer to maybe a 3-vote margin to play with for that final passage.
Interesting. Okay. And what about the Freedom Caucus? We always hear about them holding things up, making demands. Your sources highlighted a moment where their leverage seemed to just evaporate on this bill.
Yeah, it's a fascinating detail from your sources. Despite all the public talk and lists of demands, the analysis suggests many Freedom Caucus members ended up voting yes. Apparently, after some direct pressure.
Oh.
Reportedly, Donald Trump was pretty forceful, telling them they, needed to get on board.
Huh. So after all that noise, a lot of them just fell in line under pressure. Except for Massey and Davidson, you said.
Correct. Your sources really frame this specific moment as showing a surprising, maybe, lack of actual leverage from that group, at least on this particular bill.
All right, so the bills squeak through the House. Now let's look at the impact. Who wins? Who loses? According to the analysis in your sources.
Well, this bill, as your material describes it, it definitely has some clear winners and losers. Pretty much depends on your income bracket.
Okay, let's start at the top then. Sounds like good news for wealthier folks?
Definitely, according to your sources, the single biggest cost in this thing is extending the 2017 tax cuts. That's $2.2 trillion over 10 years. Just staggering.
Wow.
And these cuts, they overwhelmingly benefit the wealthiest Americans. The CBO estimates cited in your sources, they project the top 10% of earners could see their income bump up by maybe 3–4% in different years because of this.
Okay, how about the middle class? Your sources suggested it's more of a mixed bag. Maybe even leaning negative.
That seems to be the read, yeah. There are parts that sound okay, like increasing the SALT cap, that's the state and local tax deduction cap.
All right.
Raising it helps in high-tax states.
Right.
And increasing the standard deduction. But on the other hand, the bill wipes out most federal student loan forgiveness programs. So that hurts a lot of middle-class families.
And there's a potential wider economic hit, too, isn't there, beyond just the direct provisions?
Exactly. Your sources connect those dots. If this bill pushes up the deficit and makes the bond market nervous, which could happen, that could mean higher interest rates on everything. Credit cards, mortgages, business loans, prices go up.
Mm-hmm.
And that could easily cancel out any small tax savings for middle-class folks.
And for people at the lower end of the income scale, your sources paint a pretty grim picture there.
They really do. The bill includes some pretty substantial cuts to programs that serve low-income Americans. Medicaid for health insurance, facing an estimated $800 billion cut over 10 years.
$800 billion.
Yeah. Your sources project that could mean 8 million people losing health coverage, and SNAP, the food aid program. Maybe 3 million people could lose that assistance.
And the sources kind of push back against a common talking point here too, right? About who is affected.
Yes. The narrative you sometimes hear, that these cuts mostly hit able-bodied men, your sources analysis contradicts that. It highlights that the people most impacted are often women who are caregivers or, people looking after sick family members.
And CBO numbers back this up, the negative impact on the poor.
They do. The analysis suggests the lowest 10% of income earners could actually lose 4% of their income over various years. One source uses this really stark comparison. It says, for every dollar of potential benefit poor people might get from this bill, they stand to lose about $50 from cuts to aid and services. That's based on the CBO projections of total gains versus losses for that group.
Wow, $50 lost for every dollar gained. That really puts it in perspective. Your sources also mention something called Trump accounts. What's that about?
According to the analysis, those are seen largely as, political theater. Small items thrown in that sound good but don't really have much actual impact compared to the huge shifts in taxes and spending we're talking about.
Like that thing about canceling taxes on tips?
Exactly. Which your sources note actually passed the Senate unanimously anyway, so not really a controversial part of this specific bill.
So the overall read from your sources is, this looks like a pretty traditional Republican bill.
Yeah.
Heavily tilted towards the wealthy. And maybe leaving populists feeling like the little guy didn't get much.
That's the conclusion drawn in your material, yeah. Noting reported unhappiness from people like Steve Bannon and Orrin Cass about the final outcome.
Okay, let's talk about the math behind this bill, because your sources point out a massive discrepancy.
Yeah, this is where it gets pretty shaky. The Republican calculation, it claims the bill generates an extra $2.6 trillion in tax revenue over 10 years.
Right.
Which supposedly reduces the addition to the national debt by about $1 trillion.
Okay. But the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, they see something very different.
Very different. Their projection. The bill only generates around $100 billion in revenue over that same decade.
Whoa. That's not just different, that's trillions versus billions, a huge gap. And your sources connect this fuzzy math to a bigger economic risk.
They do. The analysis points out, coupling a rapidly growing debt and deficit with a, quote, skittish bond market, meaning investors are nervous about buying government debt like we've seen hints of recently that could be a recipe for trouble.
Okay, now here's where things get really interesting and frankly a bit alarming reading your sources. There's this provision buried deep, deep in this massive bill.
Yes, the one source called the contemptible section. Classic move in these huge bills, right? Slip something in, hope nobody notices or understands it fully until it's too late.
So what does this specific part, section 70302, actually do in plain English?
Okay, it's dense legalese, but your sources break it down. Basically, it stops federal courts from using their own appropriated funds, their operating budget, to enforce contempt citations.
Okay.
For things like injunctions or temporary restraining orders. But, and this is key, only if the judge didn't require a security bond when they issued the order in the first place.
Let's unpack that. Injunctions, restraining orders, those are court orders to stop someone doing something, right? Temporarily.
Exactly. To prevent harm while a case moves forward.
And the security bond, that's money the person asking for the order might have to put up.
Right. Kind of like insurance, in case the order turns out to be wrong and causes damage to the other side.
So this section says if a judge issues an order but doesn't require that bond, they can't use their court funds to punish someone for violating the order through contempt.
Precisely. And here's the kicker. Your sources explain that requiring that bond under the relevant court rule, Rule 65C, is actually very rare in federal cases. So the practical effect of this provision, it pretty much removes the court's power to enforce its own orders via contempt proceedings in, almost all federal cases.
And your sources mentioned it applies retroactively, so it could mess with orders already issued.
That's what the language suggests, yes.
Yeah.
Which is another layer to it.
Your sources draw a pretty direct line here, connecting this to an intent to weaken the courts.
Yes, the analysis explicitly links this section to what it describes as a goal. Why Donald Trump and the Republicans want to weaken the courts in this way.
Yeah.
The sources present this provision as a legislative move towards that alleged goal without, taking a side on the goal itself.
Got it. And the legal outlook. Do your sources think this thing will actually stand up in court?
Your sources predict it might squeak through the Senate, maybe. But they're pretty clear it will face immediate court challenges. The argument being it's unconstitutional because it steps on the judiciary's inherent powers.
Right.
And they don't think it'll survive those challenges in the long run. However, they also note, even if it's struck down eventually, it creates lawsuits, delays, it gums up the works, which might be its own kind of goal.
Okay. Shifting slightly, but still in the budget bill, significant cuts related to climate initiatives.
It does. After Medicaid, the second biggest chunk of savings in the bill, according to your sources,
Right.
comes from cutting Joe Biden-era climate funding, about $675 billion over 10 years.
And what kind of things are getting cut there?
Sources say it includes things like tax credits for buying electric vehicles and subsidies meant to help businesses start eco-friendly projects.
And your sources kind of push back on the idea that these are just straightforward savings, right?
They argue there are key factors the proponents of the cuts maybe don't get or just ignore. One point is, look, if the government puts in maybe 10% for a big project and private industry funds the other 90%, that government investment often pays for itself over time through, economic activity, taxes.
Right, the multiplier effect.
Exactly. And then there's the bigger picture cost.
Climate change itself.
Yeah. Your sources state pretty emphatically that the long-term, unchecked costs of global warming disasters, health impacts, you name it, will dwarf this $675 billion. So cutting this funding now might seem penny-wise, pound foolish to some.
Okay, let's move from the House to the Senate. Your sources describe some interesting procedural moves over there about overturning agency actions.
This involves Senate Majority Leader John Thune. Yeah. And using the Congressional Review Act as the CRA.
Remind us, what does the CRA usually let Congress do?
It basically gives Congress a tool, a mechanism, to overturn new rules that federal agencies put out, and they can do it with just a simple majority vote. It's meant as a check on the executive branch's regulatory power.
And your sources mentioned this latest move involved a complicated sequence of votes, and it's sort of sidestepped the Senate Parliamentarian.
Yes. The Parliamentarian? She's the Senate's official advisor on rules and procedures. Your sources note these votes were structured very carefully, so they didn't technically overrule her. Apparently, that was to ease concerns from some senators, like Susan Collins, according to the analysis.
But the end result was pretty much the same, regardless of the technicality.
That's the interpretation from your sources, yeah. They called it a distinction without a difference in practical terms. The Senate now has more leeway to use the CRA to kill agency rules with just that simple majority.
And what was the immediate target for this maneuver?
The sources state the main goal right now was to overturn the EPA waiver that lets California set its own stricter emission standards for cars, stricter than the federal ones.
Gotcha. And the broader implications, what does this Senate move signal?
Well, it sets a precedent, not just for this specific rule, but for how procedural fights might go down in the future. Your sources predict that when Democrats get the Senate majority back, they'll likely use similar tactics. Find ways around the parliamentarian to strike down decisions they don't like.
And on that California emissions point, your sources suggested that even if this whole thing gets tied up in court battles, California's influence might win out anyway.
They make a really good point there. Car companies, they're not just thinking about the next election cycle or even just the U.S. They look long-term, 30 years out, globally.
Right.
And because California is such a massive market and often leads the way, your sources suggest the industry is probably already baking in stricter standards, meaning California's pull might shape things regardless of these short-term political fights.
Interesting. Okay, from Congress to the Supreme Court, your sources reported a deadlock on a pretty significant case about religious charter schools.
Yes. The court split 4-4. It was a case out of Oklahoma about whether public money could go to a private religious charter school.
And when the Supreme Court deadlocks 4-4, what happens?
The lower court's ruling just stands. It's automatically affirmed. So in this instance, the Oklahoma Supreme Court had ruled against using public funds for the religious charter school. So that decision holds, for now at least.
Why only 8 justices hearing it?
Justice Amy Coney Barrett recused herself. Apparently, she has a close personal friendship with a legal advisor who was involved with the Catholic schools petitioning the court.
Okay. And what was the Oklahoma Supreme Court's reasoning for saying no to the funding?
Your sources explain their view was basically, look, if you want public funds, you have to follow state laws for charter schools. And that includes rules about employment, about curriculum, and they found that requires charter schools using state money to be secular.
But the argument from the other side was,
The plaintiffs argued, hey, a charter school is basically just a private school running on public funds. So religious schools should be eligible, just like other private schools might get some public support. Religious groups generally agreed with that.
and there was that fascinating political split within Oklahoma on this, too.
Yeah, that was unusual. The Republican Attorney General, Gentner Drummond, actually opposed the funding, while the Republican Governor, Kevin Stitt, supported it. You don't often see that kind of split within the same party on an issue like this.
And the AG's reasoning, according to your sources, it wasn't purely separation of church and state.
No, his stated worry was about, quote, unintended consequences. He argued, look, if you open this door, if you say public money can fund religious schools, you might end up having to fund religions that many people find abhorrent. He specifically mentioned the risk of funding, like radical Islamic schools.
Wow, that's a very direct concern he voiced. And your sources seem pretty convinced this issue isn't over. It'll be back at the Supreme Court.
They fully expect it, maybe with slightly different facts, maybe from a different state, but this 4-4 split didn't really settle the core constitutional question.
Okay, now let's turn to that really eyebrow-raising administrative action your sources described, the Trump administration going after Harvard University.
Yeah, this involved the Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, revoking Harvard's SEVP certification.
What exactly is SEVP certification?
It stands for the Student and Exchange Visitor Program. Basically, universities need this certification from DHS to legally enroll international students who are here on F1 and M1 visas.
So taking that away would mean?
It'd mean any international students on those visas at Harvard would immediately lose their legal status. They'd be forced to either transfer to another certified school, like right away, or just leave the U.S.
And your sources described the out offered to Harvard as Big Brother-ish. What was DHS demanding?
It was a huge list. Basically, Harvard had to hand over tons of documents, video, audio, about any student, international or not, who'd broken laws, university rules, or even just participated in protests.
Wow.
DHS would then review all that stuff to decide which international students to deport and what kind of additional punishment other students might face. Your sources raised serious questions about whether Harvard could even legally hand over that kind of student information.
So what did your sources suggest was the real motivation here?
The analysis in your sources, it views this as pretty clearly retaliatory, like an action designed to be a public spectacle. To own the libs, punish the eggheads at an elite place like Harvard.
Right.
The sources quote Kristi Noem saying publicly something like, this should be a warning to every other university, which kind of supports that reading. One source also briefly connects it to the whole debate around campus protests and anti-Semitism, suggesting the administration hinted this was part of dealing with those issues.
Your sources also critiqued the timing, didn't they? Announcing it during graduation week.
They did. Seemed kind of odd. Why announce it then? It gives Harvard the maximum amount of time to gear up a legal response, file for an injunction, things like that. Announcing it, say, right before school starts in August. That would have caused way more chaos and immediate pain for students.
And what potential workarounds did your sources suggest Harvard might try?
Well, beyond the obvious legal challenges, the analysis mentioned things like maybe using existing exchange programs more, or even setting up temporary satellite campuses somewhere else, like collaborating with a university in, say, Montreal maybe.
And finally on this, your sources highlighted a really fascinating legal angle from a UCLA professor, something about civil racketeering suits.
Yes, Professor Jonathan Zasloff. He suggested that universities targeted like this, say Harvard, could potentially file civil IHI suits against the individual administration members involved.
ISIO, like mob stuff.
Well, IFIA stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It's often used criminally against organized crime, sure, but it also allows for civil lawsuits. Your sources explain it can apply to groups of people associated, in fact, like administration officials working together.
And what would they need to prove in a civil IRHAC case like this?
You'd need to show the individuals worked together and committed at least 2 predicate acts. These are specific crimes listed in the IGO statute, things like extortion, bribery, maybe obstruction of justice could fit. And your sources point out something important. Unlike criminal cases, civil suits aren't necessarily blocked by presidential immunity. They cite the Paula Jones case against Bill Clinton as an example.
So your sources present this civil RSC idea as maybe a tactic, a way to put individual officials on personal notice that these actions could have real consequences for them, even after they leave office.
That seems to be the framing, yes. A way to inject some personal risk for the officials carrying out these directives.
All right, let's totally shift gears now. Lighten the mood, maybe, with a moment of, well, maybe not joy, but definitely interesting media failure. Your sources had a story under This Week in Schadenfreude.
Ah, yes. The Chicago Sun-Times book list saga.
What went wrong there?
So the paper published this list, right? 15 books for summer reading. And the authors listed. They're real famous authors. But your sources reveal the books themselves. Totally fake. Apparently generated by an AI bot.
Wait, fake books by real authors? That's just weird. Can you give an example?
Sure. One mentioned in your sources was a supposed book called The Last Algorithm by Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian.
Right.
Or Hurricane Season by Britt Bennett, author of The Vanishing Half. These books just don't exist.
And the irony here, as your sources point out, is pretty rich, isn't it?
It really is. The Sun-Times itself has run editorials warning about AI risks. Errors, biases, generating misinformation.
And using unidentified AI content like this, it was described pretty harshly.
Yeah, your sources didn't mince words. Called it an act of extreme dishonesty. Strong disapproval of relying on AI like that, especially without telling anyone.
Okay, let's try and end on a genuine high note. From media blunders to actual progress, your sources had a section for This Week in Freud about the move towards green transportation.
Yes, this is a really positive thread running through your material. It highlights that, look, despite political headwinds in some places, the global shift to cleaner transportation is definitely picking up speed.
And that matters because transportation is such a big chunk of emissions, right?
Huge. Your sources remind us it's about 30% of global warming pollution. So cleaning up how we get around is, well, a really big deal.
And the driving force isn't just government rules.
No, what's interesting is your sources point out a lot of this push is coming from industry itself. The manufacturers, they see this as a long-term global thing, a market shift that, temporary political changes aren't really going to stop.
So what are some concrete examples of progress your sources mentioned?
There are quite a few across different sectors. In Europe, you've got Porsche investing big in synthetic fuels, e-diesel, e-kerosene. They can cut emissions by up to 85%.
Wow.
An Italian company, Brembo, famous for brake pads, they've developed new pads that cut down on that fine particulate dust, which is a pollutant, by 90%, meeting new European standards. In the U.S., an auto parts maker, Borg-Warner, is aiming for carbon-neutral parts production by 2035.
And it's not just passenger cars.
Logistics, too, yeah. Delivery companies experimenting with electric vans, alternative fuels like hydrogen, or HVO 100 that's made from recycled grease. Your sources noted Lime, the scooter company. They cut their logistics pollution by an amazing 90%. And UPS, using complex algorithms for efficient routes, which your sources quipped is either AI or dangerously close to it.
Public transport's making big strides, too.
Absolutely. London, for example, mandated its whole bus fleet, even the iconic double-deckers, has to be zero emissions by 2034. Your sources note each zero-emission double-decker saves about 23 tons of CO2 a year. Governments can sometimes push these big, long-term projects that maybe private companies would hesitate on because of the upfront cost.
Even airlines are getting in on it.
Yeah, even flying, though it's slower going. They're experimenting with sustainable aviation fuel, SAF. Boeing says its new planes will be SAF compatible by 2030. Airlines like Delta, United, they're setting goals for carbon-neutral fleets way out by 2050.
So the overall outlook from your sources on transport seems pretty positive about the direction anyway.
It's very clear. The future of how we move is green. Your sources really emphasize that, yeah, there's often a higher initial cost for green tech, but it frequently ends up being cheaper long-term. Lower fuel costs, less maintenance.
Right.
Opposition can slow things down, sure, but the fundamental trend seems pretty unstoppable.
Well, that was a real journey through the material you provided, a proper deep dive. We've hit everything from messy legislative fights and court rulings to surprising administrative power plays, bizarre media mistakes, and actually some really promising shifts in technology.
Yeah, the goal was to cut through that daily noise for you, help you quickly grab the key points and maybe see how these seemingly separate stories actually connect.
Hopefully you feel a bit more informed now, better equipped to think about how all these pieces fit together.
And, looking back across all these different topics from your sources, It's kind of striking how many boil down to these fundamental tensions, isn't it?
Hmm.
Like balancing government spending and debt versus social needs and economic growth, or the strategic use of power versus trying to apply rules impartially, or just that inevitable clash between old systems, old ways of doing things, and disruptive new technologies.
That's a great point. How do you see those core tensions playing out? How might they shape what happens next in the coming months or years? Definitely is something to mull over.
It certainly is. Food for thought.
For now, though, thank you so much for providing the sources that made this deep dive possible today.